Well, hi again. So this is another installment of my blog on the people side of digital transformation. And today what I want to talk about is the flexibility paradox. So generally there's an agreement that we live in a time of change, very fast change, and that the only thing that we have any certainty about is that things will change. At a highly philosophical level, the source of this change are underlying tensions that are operating continuously in our lives, and that are just, the tension between sort of opposing poles is really what drives the dynamics of life, right? So this is the assumptions of a theory called dialectics. And so there are calls in the management literature that we need dialectic management approaches. And so that's really what I want to be talking about today. But first of all, let's get started with the flexibility paradox. So when we think about organizations today, there are a lot of calls for increased flexibility, which we associate with innovation, with change, with personalization, and we contrast it with structure, which we associate with lockdown processes and routine and efficiency and prior knowledge that gets exploited for efficiency gains and so on. The productivity paradox, however, says that these two opposing concepts are highly interrelated. And not only can we, only understand flexibility in the context of structure or relative to structure, but they are also, the one cannot exist without the other. So what that implies is that if we want flexibility, we need structure. So even the more flexibility we want, the more structure we need. And that's the nature of the paradox. Hard to wrap your head around having these opposing concepts that are at odds with one another, basically being that codependent on one another. So, of course, when it comes to digital transformation, this is what we see over and over again, where structured aspects of the organization are constraining sort of the flexibility of e-commerce, of the digitalization of products, and so on. A current challenge for organizations today is, of course, to find ways of integrating holding these opposing thoughts together and in a productive way. So what are these different ways in which we can hold these thoughts together? So let me start out by saying the first one, polarizing, is not an example of dialectic management. It's what some people refer to as dichotomous, either-or thinking. So the idea here being, I either have flexibility or I have structure. And so here's a quick example. I remember talking to a CIO about ITIL a number of years ago. And his IT ops organization wanted to implement, these deep structures of ITIL, and essentially force the rest of the organization to treat them with the kind of respect that they felt they needed in order to get their work done effectively. The CIO was resisting this push towards ITIL, saying that all this highly structured kind of these highly structured processes, all they would accomplish would be a check-the-box mentality, which he felt was counterproductive in light of his current organization, which was able to do things quickly and which was able to sometimes beat the prices of outsourcers, that he might otherwise have employed. And so he preferred to hang on to this hero culture, warts and all, rather than go the route of, these very structured processes. And what he felt were just going to be constraints on the organization and increases in cost that he did not want to incur. Another approach is to say, okay, these two things are complementary, right? But I might operationalize them in different parts of the organization. So, for example, I might say, okay, the IT ops, right? You guys, you can do ITIL, do your process, have at it. Whereas, in order to increase the flexibility for my customers, I'm going to, insist that the application development folks use Agile. And so, I've got these two aspects working side by side in the organization. The only challenge is, of course, when they need to interface. And that's when it becomes clear that the one is constraining the other. So the Agile group can only be as agile as the Ops group will allow them to be. And of course, the agility practices are very much at odds with these highly locked down processes, that ITIL would have recommended, which are all about being very specific on your requirements and being able to document. Another approach is to say, okay, well, forget about these tensions. We don't want to manage tension. So let's just put together a new set of practices that somehow magically integrate, the flexibility of Agile and the structure of Ops, right? Or the structure that Ops needs. And so this has been developed into the DevOps set of practices. And at a more conceptual level, we might hear organizations talking about ambidexterity or the ambidextrous organization or ambidextrous leadership. And ambidextrous, we know, is sort of being able to work with the left and the right hand, right? So being able to be as comfortable with flexibility as with structure. And then the last approach is one of mutuality, which is really what sort of an age of paradox really implies. And that is that the more flexibility I want, the more structure I need to have. And so an example here might be, a salesperson who's trying to expand the services, to their customers, no longer selling merely products, but selling products plus digital services to go along with them, services related to, analytics, for example. And in order to be able to offer a customer these kinds of things, they would need to make sure that they can, have a process inside the organization that they can bring together the various players, to help them. And so one of the things that a mutuality approach has to focus on is, in fact, this interface. It is what we refer to sometimes as boundary spanning, spanning the various groups that have different cultures, different traditions, different processes. And so, sometimes these are referred to as cross-functional teams. Sometimes they're referred to as skunkworks projects. Certainly, this is an issue about leadership, being able to value and work with, conflict and sort of find the value in integrating two conflicting sets of ideas. And so that's really sort of where the challenge of ambidextrous thinking comes in, as well as sort of these dialectic management logics. So what does this all mean? So I think the first thing to say is how these contradictions or opposing poles are set up is really up to the organization. So this becomes a managerial choice. Whether you set it up as so intentioned that they cannot be integrated, or that they are mutually dependent on one another and therefore need to be managed continuously, it's really up to you. And so I think that's an issue of managerial choice. When it comes to responses, the least productive is the either-or approach, because, the underlying tension of structure, flexibility is never going to go away. It's always been there and always will be there. So you really want to be pursuing more sophisticated dialectic responses. So either you might sort of adopt this layered architecture, thinking that we know from hardware, where, the things that are more stable control and that are more physical, for example, hardware, right? And the work that the IT ops group typically does, right? They might be, sort of further down in the stack and therefore more structured, versus the apps folks, right? That have the interface to the customer, where the customer needs this flexible response, right? That they would do something that is more along the lines of agile development. The transcendence, again, this notion of find a bigger concept like the ambidextrous organization and build an entire set of practices that embraces ambidexterity and let the actual conflict just sort of pretend it isn't there, right? You mask over it in some way. And mutuality is essentially to say, I recognize the conflict, I recognize the competing ideas, and I recognize the value of the conflict. How can I use boundary spanning resources to essentially harness the potential of this tension that I have in terms of this paradox. All right, that's it from me for this week. I hope you find something interesting in these ideas and something that's helpful in terms of thinking about the organizational problems that you currently face. Thanks and goodbye.